A single dad thought he was just helping out with a broken-down car, but destiny had something else in store. A struggling woman, a little girl's whispered plea, and a simple act of kindness that would reshape 3 lives forever. Don't miss this deeply moving story. Let's begin. In a quiet town where neighbors still waved from their porches, Jordan had just wrapped up another long day at his auto shop. The late summer sun dipped low as he wiped his hands clean and locked up, ready to return to his quiet home with more silence than company. Jordan was locking up the garage when he heard the unmistakable rattle of an engine choking on its last breath. He turned and spotted a worn-down sedan stalled on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly and steam curling from under the hood. Without thinking, he walked over. As he approached, the driver's side door creaked open and a woman stepped out, followed by a little girl clinging to her hand. The woman looked tired but composed, clearly holding it together for the child. She explained the engine died after a long day of driving. They had just moved to town and didn't know anyone. She admitted she couldn't afford a tow. Jordan didn't hesitate. He told her he owned the garage just across the road and offered to push the car in to take a look. She introduced herself as Leah, and the girl was Sophie. Together, they managed to get the car into the shop. Leah hovered quietly near the entrance while Sophie wandered, touching everything in sight and staring wide-eyed at the tools on the wall. Jordan popped the hood and got to work. It didn't take long to figure out the issue, just a loose battery cable and a worn belt. While his hands moved through the familiar motions, he watched Sophie out of the corner of his eye as she gently spun an old tire and whispered that the place smelled like stories. Jordan smiled without stopping his work. Leah stayed silent, arms crossed, watching everything, her face still lined with worry. When he finished the repair, Jordan turned to them and said the car was ready. Leah looked surprised, then asked how much she owed. Jordan leaned against the fender and said it was on the house. He saw her hesitate, as if unsure whether to accept it or argue. She finally whispered a quiet thank you, one hand tightening around her purse. Sophie clapped and said they could go home now. Leah crouched to buckle her daughter in, then turned to Jordan once more, her expression softer this time. Before she closed the door, Sophie leaned toward the window and said he was really nice, that her mom didn't usually smile, but she was smiling now. Leah's face flushed, and she brushed her daughter's hair aside before whispering that she sometimes said things without thinking. Jordan simply nodded, not wanting to make her more uncomfortable. The engine started cleanly, and as the car began to roll away, Sophie waved and shouted through the window not to forget what she said. Jordan watched the car disappear down the road, his hand still raised in a wave. Back inside the garage, he sat for a moment at his workbench, staring at his tools, but thinking about something else. That little girl's words had hit harder than expected. He thought about his own daughter, who stayed with her aunt most of the time. He hadn't seen her in a couple of weeks, and the silence in his apartment was always louder after those weekends ended. Leah and Sophie reminded him of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of connection, even if just for a moment. He stayed at the garage longer than usual that night, wiping down tools that were already clean and checking things that didn't need checking. He tried to shake the feeling, but it stayed with him, lingering like a conversation that ended too soon. On the other side of town, Leah drove through unfamiliar streets, her hands gripping the wheel, eyes scanning signs and streetlights. Sophie was humming in the back seat, legs swinging, her small voice full of unbothered joy. Leah wanted to tell her not to say things like that to strangers, but part of her didn't have the energy. She had spent years building walls to keep people out and protect her daughter from getting too attached to anyone. But that man in the garage hadn't asked for anything. He didn't charge a dime. He didn't act like they were a problem. He just helped. That felt rare. Too rare. Sophie said he was the one, and Leah knew it was just something kids said, something innocent and sweet. But it still stuck with her as they pulled into the driveway of their small rental. That night, Leah tucked Sophie into bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The image of grease-stained hands fixing something without hesitation playing again and again in her mind. Across town, Jordan sat alone at his kitchen table, an untouched dinner going cold beside him. He kept thinking about the girl's voice and the way her mother looked like she hadn't had someone to rely on in a long time. It wasn't pity he felt, but something closer to recognition. He knew what loneliness looked like. He saw it in the mirror every morning. And for one strange, unexpected moment in that garage, he hadn't felt so alone that the week dragged on. But Jordan found his thoughts drifting back to Leah and Sophie more often than he wanted to admit. He had fixed countless cars over the years, met dozens of drivers stranded on the roadside, but this was different. It wasn't the repair that lingered, it was the look in Leah's eyes when she realized she didn't owe him anything. It was Sophie's unfiltered honesty when she said her mom was smiling because of him. Jordan told himself it was just another good deed, but deep down he knew it had stirred something he had buried a long time ago. On Thursday afternoon, the sound of an engine rolling into the lot pulled him out of his thoughts. He looked up, and there it was, the same sedan, the same two faces. His first reaction was worry. Had the repair failed? But the engine sounded fine. Leah parked neatly and stepped out, brushing her hair behind her ear, her daughter already hopping out of the back seat. Sophie ran across the lot and grabbed his hand before he could even say hello. She announced loudly that she had told her mom he was the one, just like she said before. Jordan chuckled, crouching to her level, and asked how her first week in town had gone. Sophie replied that school was strange. The kids were curious, but she liked the playground. She squeezed his fingers and asked if he could come visit someday. Jordan glanced at Leah, who looked embarrassed, but her smile was more relaxed this time. Leah explained that nothing was wrong with the car. Sophie had been insisting they come back to thank him properly. She shifted her weight awkwardly, then asked if he would like to join them for coffee at the diner across the street. It was her way of offering something back without making it a transaction. Jordan hesitated only briefly before agreeing. He closed up the shop early, and together the three of them walked to the small diner that sat on the corner, its windows glowing warmly in the fading light. Inside, the air smelled of strong coffee and fresh pie. They slid into a booth, Leah on one side, Jordan on the other, with Sophie in between leaning against him as if she had known him forever. Leah stirred her coffee slowly before speaking. She told him about the move, about how she had been raising Sophie alone since the day she was born, about the endless balancing act of work, bills, and motherhood. She admitted it hadn't been easy, but she wanted her daughter to have a fresh start in a quieter town. Jordan listened without interrupting, nodding at the parts where her voice cracked. He could see the strength in her words, even when she didn't recognize it herself. When it was his turn, he shared about Maddie, his daughter. He explained the divorce, the strain of trying to raise a child when the bills never seemed to stop piling up, and the guilt that came with letting his sister take more responsibility than he wanted. His voice faltered when he admitted how empty his apartment felt after Maddie left each weekend. Leah reached across the table and touched his hand, her voice firm as she told him he wasn't less of a father for struggling. He had done what was necessary to make sure his daughter had stability, and that was strength, not weakness. For a moment, Jordan forgot about the noise of the diner around them and just focused on her steady eyes. Sophie watched the exchange with a smile too wise for her age. She rested her chin on her hands and whispered that because they both understood each other, it meant they belonged together. Leah laughed and shook her head, calling it imagination, but her eyes betrayed something softer, something she was not ready to admit aloud. Jordan only smiled and let the child's words hang in the air, The afternoon slipped into evening as the three of them talked. Stories flowed easily. They spoke about sleepless nights, small victories, and moments that tested them. Jordan found himself laughing more than he had in years, and Leah admitted it felt good to finally have someone listen without judgment. By the time the plates were cleared and their coffee cups were empty, Sophie had drifted to sleep, her head resting comfortably on Jordan's arm. The sight of her daughter leaning so naturally against this man left Leah quiet, but not unsettled. Instead, it felt strangely right, like something that had been missing had clicked into place without force. When it was time to leave, Jordan carried Sophie back to the car while Leah walked beside him. The night air was cool, and the quiet between them was comfortable rather than strained. At the car, he gently set Sophie in the backseat and adjusted the blanket around her. Leah lingered beside him, their hands brushing as they worked. Their eyes met, and in that unspoken moment, neither felt the need to explain what was stirring. Leah whispered her thanks not just for the repair, but for listening. Jordan's voice was low when he replied that sometimes the right people walk into our lives when we least expect it. Leah hesitated as she slid into the driver's seat, then rolled down the window and asked if maybe they could do this again. Jordan smiled and said he would like that. Sophie stirred awake just long enough to wave sleepily and remind her mom that she had been right all along. Leah laughed, shaking her head, but her eyes glowed with a warmth Jordan hadn't seen before. As their car pulled away, Jordan stood in the dim streetlight, his heart unexpectedly lighter. Back in his apartment that night, he replayed every detail, the way Sophie's hand fit so easily in his, the way Leah's voice softened when she finally let down her guard, the way the laughter felt like something he had been missing for far too long. For the first time in years, the silence in his apartment didn't feel unbearable. Instead, it felt full of possibility. The following days carried a quiet anticipation. Jordan went about his work as usual, but every sound of an engine outside the garage made him glance toward the road, half hoping it was Leah and Sophie pulling in again. He tried to convince himself he was being foolish, that they had only shared one afternoon together, but the truth was undeniable. Something about that day had stayed with him. It wasn't just gratitude or the memory of Sophie's innocent words. It was the sense that, for the first time in years, life might be offering him another chance at something more. One late afternoon, just as the sun began dipping behind the rooftops, the familiar sedan rolled into the lot. Jordan felt his chest tighten, but this time there was no worry. The car sounded fine. Leah stepped out with a small smile, and Sophie bolted from the back seat straight into the garage, announcing proudly that they had come to visit. Leah laughed and admitted that her daughter had insisted all week, saying she wanted to see the man who made her mom smile. Jordan wiped his hands on a rag and welcomed them in. They spent the next hour sitting on the workbench and chatting. Sophie darted around the shop, pointing out tools she remembered and asking Jordan endless questions. Leah leaned against the wall, more at ease now, her laughter more frequent than before. When Sophie finally asked if they could all go back to the diner, Jordan agreed without hesitation. The three of them crossed the street together once again, but this time it didn't feel like two strangers sharing coffee. It felt like a small family slipping into a familiar routine. Inside the diner, Sophie claimed the seat next to Jordan, chattering about her week at school. Leah shook her head at her daughter's boldness, but her eyes were soft. Over dinner, Leah shared more of her story. She had moved to town for a new job and hoped it would give her daughter stability she had never truly known. She admitted it wasn't easy to keep going when most days felt like an uphill climb, but Sophie was her reason to keep pushing forward. Jordan listened, admiring the quiet strength in every word. When she asked about his daughter again, he spoke of Maddie with warmth and a trace of regret. He confessed how guilty he sometimes felt for not being able to give her everything she deserved. Leah reached across the table once more, steady and firm, and told him guilt had no place in a heart that still tried. Sophie grinned knowingly, whispering that she liked him even more now, and both adults laughed, shaking their heads at her honesty. After dinner, they walked back toward the garage slowly, Sophie skipping ahead while Jordan and Leah trailed behind. Their conversation was lighter now, comfortable. Jordan admitted he hadn't laughed like this in years. Leah admitted she hadn't felt this safe around anyone in a long time. The words lingered between them, heavier than either wanted to admit, but neither pulled away. When they reached the car, Sophie was already climbing into the back seat, humming a tune only she knew. Leah stood beside Jordan a moment longer, brushing her jacket nervously before thanking him again, not for anything specific, but for being there. He told her she didn't need to thank him, but the way she looked at him made it clear she wasn't just being polite. That night, Jordan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the untouched stack of bills. But instead of the usual weight that came with them, he felt something different: hope, the memory of Leah's smile, the way Sophie had leaned against his side as though she belonged there, filled the room with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He realized that what he had found wasn't just a connection. It was the beginning of healing he hadn't even known he needed. Days turned into weeks, and their visits became more frequent. Sometimes Leah and Sophie stopped by the shop with sandwiches for lunch. Other times Jordan met them at the park, where Sophie would run ahead while he and Leah sat on the bench talking about everything from work to childhood memories. Sophie was always there, bridging the space between them with her laughter and her unfiltered truths. She told him once that her mom had been alone too long, and that he had been alone too long too, so now they could fix it together. Jordan didn't know how to respond, but Leah's eyes glistened when she heard it, and though she told her daughter not to say such things, she didn't sound convinced by her own words. One evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and purple, Leah invited Jordan to walk them home after dinner. Sophie skipped ahead, chasing fireflies, while the two adults walked side by side. Leah confessed that when her car broke down that first night, she had felt like everything was falling apart, but meeting him had made her believe in second chances. Jordan admitted that he had felt the same way, that sometimes life brought the right people at the exact moment you needed them most. Their hands brushed lightly as they walked, and this time, neither pulled away. When they reached Leah's door, Sophie bounded inside, leaving the two of them standing together on the porch. The silence between them was gentle, filled with the weight of unspoken things. Leah looked at him with tired but hopeful eyes and whispered that she wasn't used to someone staying. Jordan looked back at her and promised softly that he wasn't planning on leaving. For a long moment, they just stood there, letting the night settle around them, both realizing that the broken-down car had been the beginning of something neither of them had expected but both of them needed. Back in his own apartment that night, Jordan thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. A stalled engine, a whispered plea, a child's unguarded hope. He realized that what he had repaired for Leah that night was never just a car. It was trust, it was faith, it was the belief that life could still surprise them with something good. And as he closed his eyes, he knew he was no longer carrying his burdens alone. That night, Jordan sat in his small apartment, but the silence didn't press on him the way it usually did. Instead of emptiness, his mind replayed the sound of Sophie's laughter, the warmth of Leah's smile, and the way that little girl's hand had slipped so naturally into his. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, a glimpse of the family he thought he had lost forever. He realized that what he had repaired that night wasn't only a car. In giving freely, in choosing kindness without expecting anything in return, he had been handed something priceless. He had been reminded that love, hope, and second chances could find you when you least expected them. The following days moved differently. Jordan caught himself checking the clock, listening for the sound of Leah's sedan pulling into the lot. Not because he wanted more work, but because he wanted more of the peace they had brought into his life. Fixing cars had always been about engines and tools, but now it felt like fate had rolled a broken-down vehicle his way to mend something inside him. Leah and Sophie had come to him needing help, yet they had given him the greater gift: reasons to smile, to hope, and to believe again. And as he closed the shop one evening, Jordan whispered to himself, "Sometimes miracles arrive with grease-stained hands."